Immediately after my husband's funeral, my mother-in-law threw me out of the house, out into the street in -30 degrees. But I had a feeling she was hiding something, so I waited. I knew I had a spare key to the apartment, one she didn't know about. I had kept it all this time, and when she finally left the apartment, I went back in. But the moment I stepped inside, I froze in horror. I couldn't believe everything that was happening to me right then, when my heart was breaking from the loss of my husband. He was the meaning of my life. We had spent several years together, and although my relationship with his family hadn't always been easy, we all lived under the same roof. Everything seemed fine. I believed that after his death, we would all come together to get through this terrible moment as a family. But the opposite happened. The morning after the funeral, when I returned to my husband's apartment, his mother, my mother-in-law, met me with a cold, harsh tone and told me I no longer had any right to be there. I couldn't find the words to oppose her. She repeated without mercy that the apartment had always belonged to her and her son, never to me. I tried to explain that we were legally married, that there were documents confirming my rights, but she was immovable. It felt like her anger and hatred had erased any trace of reason. She wouldn't calm down. She insisted, nearly screaming, that I leave immediately. I stood there, stunned, unable to understand where was all this rage coming from. Just days ago, she seemed to grieve beside me. Or was that only a performance? Next thing I knew, I was out on the building's front steps. The wind howled like something wounded, and the snow that had built up overnight reached nearly to my knees. The cold was unbearable, around 30 degrees below zero. I had no coat. She had literally shoved me out, snatched my jacket from my hands, and tossed it aside with a cruel indifference. "Your train has long since left. You have no reason to be here anymore," she said. Her frozen stare cut through my pleas like ice. She slammed the door in my face. I stood there on the landing, the cold creeping under my thin blouse, making me tremble. Not just from the chill, but from fear. I felt stripped of everything, not just warmth or shelter, but of basic human compassion. My tears did nothing to warm me, but I knew I couldn't stay there long. I would freeze to death. I ran into the street, mumbling to myself, begging fate to ease this nightmare, even just a little. I thought of going to a neighbor's, asking someone for help, but then I realized my phone, my documents, everything I owned was still in the apartment. I had no money, no keys, no way to call for help. Just a small purse I had taken to the funeral, which held nothing more than a lipstick and an old comb. Then, by some miracle, I remembered the spare key. My husband had made it for me the year before, just in case he ever lost his. I had tossed it into my bag without thinking, and his mother didn't know it existed. I nearly cried from relief. If I could just get back in, if only for a short time, I could gather my thoughts, find some warmth, and figure out what to do next. I hid around the corner of the building so that she wouldn't see me if she looked out the window, and I waited. How long I stood there, I don't know. It felt like forever. The cold was brutal. My teeth chattered. I couldn't feel my fingers or my hands. But then I saw her. She left the building and walked quickly toward the road where a car was waiting. Odd. She usually drove her old Zhiguli, but now a sleek foreign car had pulled up for her. A man I didn't recognize was behind the wheel. Maybe it was a taxi, but the way she glanced at the license plate and how she slid into the front seat told me otherwise. Still, I didn't dwell on it. I was too cold. The moment she vanished from sight, I returned to the entryway and with trembling hands slid the key into the lock. To my relief, it worked. I slipped silently inside. The apartment was cold and damp, but still far warmer than the street. I felt as if I'd been saved, but there was something off, something heavy in the air. Everything around me reminded me of him, his photos, his things. the familiar smells of our life together. When I entered the living room, my chest tightened. I remembered our evenings together, drinking tea and dreaming of the future. A wave of bitterness surged inside me. How could his mother throw me out of the home I shared with him for so long? How could she, knowing I had no one left, no support, leave me to freeze in the street? But the deepest chill came when I stepped into the bedroom. The furniture was in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something. The bedside tables were ajar, our belongings scattered and rummaged through. Then I noticed something else. Many of our photos together were missing. Only old pictures remained, ones I wasn't in. That was strange. His mother had rarely entered our bedroom before, and now I realized she had been looking for something. Perhaps documents related to inheritance? Perhaps she was trying to destroy evidence, papers that could prove my rights? A wave of dread came over me, not the kind you feel from ghosts or shadows, but the dread that comes when you realize someone is trying to erase you, to leave you powerless. I began searching desperately for my phone, for the important papers we had kept in a separate box, but the phone was gone and the box was empty. Only wrinkled pages remained, as if someone had torn them out on purpose. Maybe she had done this before the funeral, while I was too lost in grief to notice. My knees gave out. I sank to the floor, trying to steady my breath and think. And then a thought struck me. If everything was ransacked, it meant she hadn't found what she was looking for, which meant she'd likely keep searching. Maybe she'd gone now to see a lawyer, to do something formal. But I felt deep down that this wasn't just about kicking me out. There was a secret, something hidden from me since the beginning, maybe from the very moment I entered this family. I got up, looked around the room with resignation, and remembered something. My husband's wardrobe. He used to keep family records there, old photos and letters, things he wanted to keep hidden from his mother. These items were precious to him. They revealed the story of his father, who had died under strange circumstances many years ago. He had told me once that no one ever really investigated what happened. The family simply closed that chapter, but he had always wanted to uncover the truth, to find the documents. Every time he brought it up, his mother shut the conversation down. What's the point of digging up the past? Now I wondered if I had just run into that same wall of aggression. Maybe the root of her hatred lay in those old secrets. I opened the wardrobe. It had been ransacked too. But as I dug through the piles of old clothes, I found a hidden pocket. My husband had mentioned it once. And inside, to my shock, was an old envelope. I yanked it free and tore it open. Inside were several old photos and yellowed pages, some with signatures. The handwriting was hard to decipher, perhaps written by his father himself, or maybe they were medical records. I didn't have time to study them carefully, but the documents mentioned an accident, an emergency hospitalization, and strange details about injuries. My heart clenched. Was my husband conducting his own investigation into the family tragedy? I put the documents back where I'd found them, afraid that my mother-in-law might return at any moment. I couldn't face her. I couldn't go back to pretending things were normal, but I also couldn't leave. Where would I spend the night? Where could I go? These papers might be the key to something much bigger. Maybe they held information that explained why she had thrown me out so suddenly, when I was still drowning in grief. Maybe she suspected I knew, or that I might find out the truth, but what truth? I was still trying to catch my breath when it suddenly felt like there was someone in the next room. Had she come back? My body froze. I stepped cautiously into the hallway. Gently nudging the kitchen door open, I found no one there. But then, a dull thump from the bathroom. I crept toward it, silently. The door was ajar. I peeked in, nothing, but my heart pounded. I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. I searched every room, but found no one. Maybe it was just my nerves, frayed to the limit. Maybe it was the old plumbing creaking, long overdue for repairs. Or perhaps just the shower hose slipping and hitting the wall. I never did find out. But it terrified me. Almost an hour passed. I paced the apartment like a trapped animal. At some point it became clear I needed to recover at least a few personal items, clothes, a couple of documents, maybe a photo of my husband, so that if I had to leave, I wouldn't walk away with absolutely nothing. Legally, the apartment likely belonged to my husband. We never had time to formalize it as joint property, but we had our marriage certificate, and that could change everything. I planned to find that proof, to have at least some kind of protection. But the drawer where we kept our documents had been ransacked. All I found was a copy of his birth certificate, nothing more. Inside me, an angry desperation began to rise. Everything that once belonged to both of us might now fall into her hands, and she was clearly ready to fight for it by any means necessary. But I still couldn't understand why she had acted with such cruelty, why she made such a merciless scene barely a day after the funeral. Could any normal person do something like that? Or did she blame me for her son's death? That question haunted me. My husband died suddenly. At first, everyone assumed it was a heart attack. But now, remembering the details, I realized something didn't add up. The official report had some strange points. He had complained of general discomfort, but he had never had any heart problems. And everything happened far too quickly. I remembered when she snapped at me, "You didn't take him to the doctor in time." Back then, I didn't know how to respond. How could I have guessed that something serious was hiding behind what seemed like a simple cold? Maybe she truly believed I was to blame. Maybe now she wanted revenge, and no explanation would ever change her mind. If it were only about grief, she would have just stopped talking to me. But she went much further, throwing me into the street, destroying my things, taking my documents. And now, standing among the ruins of my former life, I could feel it. There was a mystery behind all this. Something in that apartment wasn't right. I couldn't explain it logically, but my instinct screamed danger was close, and I had to uncover the truth. I decided to hide. It sounded absurd considering this had once been my home, but I knew it wasn't safe to remain there openly. At the same time, I couldn't walk away, not when this place still held answers. I had just enough time to change into something warmer, an old sweatshirt of my husband's and a pair of wool socks I found in the closet. Then I rummaged through the kitchen, looking for food or at least some tea. Everything was a mess, but on the table I spotted a pot of soup I had cooked in a hurry, just before the funeral, when he was still in the hospital. Oddly, the soup was still warm, even though days had supposedly passed. I was hungry, but fear outweighed my hunger. What if she had left it there on purpose? What if it had been poisoned? I shook off the suspicion. Maybe it was just my fraying mind imagining the worst. Still, I didn't touch the soup. I found some crackers in the cupboard and drank tap water. It was enough to calm the hunger pangs. Time passed. She didn't return. I started to worry. Maybe she had gone away for a few days, but that meant she could come back at any moment. I couldn't sit idly. I remembered that sometimes my husband used to hide useful things behind the washing machine in the bathroom. He had always loved hiding things in unusual places. It was his childhood habit. He used to say he wanted to be a detective, or, at the very least, an investigator. I stepped into the bathroom and looked around. The small cart was in its usual place, but I noticed tracks, like it had been moved recently. I gently pushed it aside and saw a small box behind it. Inside was a voice recorder and a stack of printed letters. It looked like my husband had been gathering evidence, or information about something important. I tried to turn on the recorder, but the battery was dead. Fortunately, the charger was still in the box. My heart pounded with anticipation. What if those recordings held all the answers? I plugged the device into the wall and sat on the edge of the bathtub, waiting for it to charge. Meanwhile, I began reading the letters. They were printed emails, messages to a doctor, references to lab tests he had wanted to do, links to articles about rare poisonings, and even notes about researching the true cause of his father's death. My heart dropped to my feet. Poisoning. Had my husband suspected that his father hadn't died of natural causes? And had he begun reading those articles because he sensed something was wrong with his own health? I flipped through more pages, and then a dialogue. Someone had responded to him, warning him to be careful, urging him to consider that someone close might have benefited from his death. I felt sick. It turned out my husband might have even suspected his own mother, or perhaps more distant relatives. But then, why had she been so desperate, rummaging through all our documents? Why had she thrown me out? Was she afraid I'd find these papers? Once the recorder had enough charge, I tried playing it. A fragment came through, the voice of my husband. He sounded agitated. I don't know who to trust anymore, but I have no other choice. I've seen too many strange coincidences. And if I don't make it, please. The message ended there. The file was damaged, or perhaps erased. A few other clips followed, also incomplete. I caught words like forensic, analysis, we'll do an autopsy. I couldn't make out the full context, but it was becoming clear. My husband had been conducting his own investigation. He was convinced that his father hadn't died by accident, and he feared that something similar might happen to him. A chill ran through me. Had someone threatened him? And why hadn't he told me? Or had he tried, and I just didn't listen? I had been too caught up in work, in running the household. A sharp guilt twisted inside me. If I had understood what he was going through, maybe he would still be alive. My heart ached. My knees went weak. His image appeared before me, thoughtful, at times somber, when he spoke of his family's secrets. I ran out of the bathroom, clutching the recorder and the printed emails. I had to decide what to do. Should I go to the police with this? But I doubted anyone would take it seriously. Broken audio files and scattered letters. Besides, I had no phone, no copies, and most of all, I wasn't even sure my mother-in-law was the one to blame. Maybe she really was just furious with me for past grievances. Maybe this entire mystery pointed elsewhere. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I wasn't going to give up. If my husband had begun to investigate this story, then it was my duty to finish it. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the apartment door and froze in place. I quickly turned off the light and slipped silently behind the hallway closet door. The footsteps came closer. I heard the rattle of keys. Someone was coming in. Through the narrow crack, I saw my mother-in-law enter, but she wasn't alone. With her was the same man I had seen earlier in the expensive car. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I heard them speaking in hushed voices as if they didn't want the neighbors to overhear. "She won't come back," said my mother-in-law with certainty. "I did everything to drive her out of here so she'd never dare return." "What if she does?" the man asked. "Didn't you say she might have documents?" "What documents?" she snapped. "Everything here is mine." Her voice grew irritated. "Enough of this. The main thing is that no one suspects that." She lowered her voice and I couldn't make out the rest. But I understood one thing clearly. They had already written me off. Supposedly, I had disappeared forever, frozen to death somewhere, or run off to stay with someone. But I was right there, behind the wall, hearing every word. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I was terrified that even my breathing or the rustling of my clothes would betray me. But I didn't move. I stayed completely still. "Tell me," the man said, When can we take the keys to the safe? We'll get to that, my mother-in-law replied. Tomorrow we're going to the notary, but make sure no traces are left. They were discussing the distribution of some money, mentioning surnames I didn't recognize. I sat there stunned. This woman, whom I had once seen as merely strict, now sounded like a seasoned conspirator. She believed I was gone, and so she spoke freely. I had to remain hidden at all costs, but I could feel my legs going numb. I could hardly breathe. When they moved toward the bedroom, probably to check that everything was in order, I decided to try and slip toward the front door. If they returned to the hallway, I'd be caught instantly. Following the sound of their footsteps behind the wall, I tiptoed to the kitchen. The window overlooked the backyard. It was on the second floor with a canopy just below. I could try to jump, but I risked breaking my leg. The noise would draw attention and they might chase me, but staying put also meant risking a face-to-face confrontation with my mother-in-law and her mysterious companion. I didn't want to imagine how that might end. I sat at the kitchen table and wondered if I should wait for them to leave. But judging by their conversation, they hadn't come just for a quick visit. Desperately running through options in my mind, I heard them moving again. My mother-in-law and the man came out of the bedroom. I darted into the pantry and crouched behind bags of potatoes and empty jars. The space was tight. It smelled of dampness, but there was no other choice. I tried not to breathe. She walked past the hallway, shouting about something, tossing objects around. Maybe the same things I had disturbed earlier. Dear God, when will this nightmare end? Anyway, she muttered, what matters is we buy time. Until the will is read, then everything will fall into place. Are you sure the will names you? The man asked. Or could it mention her? It says nothing about her, she replied firmly. I checked a long time ago, but I swear I have a strange feeling, like she came back and rifled through everything. We should change the locks. I froze. If they changed the locks now, I'd be trapped inside. And when they found me, God knows what they'd do. I sat there soaked in sweat, even though the storage room was cold and dark. My mother-in-law moved around the apartment. Soon I heard her footsteps coming very close. She opened the pantry door. A sliver of light fell directly on my face, but her eyes glanced past, apparently not looking down. Nothing here, she mumbled, already closing the door. Let's go to the living room. I had no idea how much longer I could stay like that. My legs were going numb, my head buzzing, but I knew there was no other way. I had to endure. That's when I remembered the documents. I had stuffed the printed emails and the recorder into my pocket. If my mother-in-law decided to search every corner, she might find them. But it was unlikely she knew I had already discovered them. Maybe half an hour passed. I was barely conscious from fear and lack of air. I overheard more talk about the notary, about bank accounts. They could leave at any moment, or they might stay the night. Then I heard her complain that she was tired and wanted to rest. The man responded, "Let's go to my place. It's cold here anyway. We'll come back in the morning, bring the new lock, and finish everything quickly." Those words were a gift from heaven. A few minutes later, they really did leave, closing the door behind them. I heard their steps descending the stairs, and finally the sound of the building's entrance opening and closing. Still, I stayed in the pantry for another 10 minutes, afraid it might be a trick. At last, when I felt sure, I slipped out and ran straight to the front door. It wasn't locked with a chain. I peeked through the peephole to make sure the hallway was clear. Staying here any longer would be dangerous. They planned to return in the morning with a new lock. I needed to find a safe place for the night and figure out what to do next. But to leave empty-handed would mean defeat. I had some leads in my pocket, but I needed our marriage certificate, some formal proof. Searching the apartment again was terrifying, but I knew I might not get another chance. I ran to the bedroom, rummaging through folders and boxes, hoping to find something. Finally, in an old suitcase we kept under the bed, I found a slim folder with my old documents. But there was no marriage certificate. What I did find was a small USB flash drive taped to the inner wall of the folder. Why had my husband hidden it there? It must contain something important. I grabbed the USB, shoved it in my pocket along with the prints and the recorder, and without looking back, I ran for the exit. When the door closed behind me, I felt the cold wind of the stairwell, but it was the air of freedom. I knew I had to get out before my mother-in-law returned, but where would I go? The street was freezing, I had no phone, no money. Then I remembered a former co-worker who lived nearby, someone I had always gotten along with. Maybe she would take me in for a night. It was a risk, but I had no other choice. As I walked to her home, freezing and crying, it wasn't just the cold that hurt. It was the injustice, the betrayal. How could people you once considered family treat you like this? Had my mother-in-law done something terrible to her own son? And who was that man with whom she was conspiring? My heart beat with longing for answers. I knew there was no turning back now. I had to uncover the truth for my husband's memory and for my own survival. I spent a few days at my colleague's place. I only told her part of the story, that my mother-in-law had thrown me out and that we were having a dispute over the apartment. I didn't want to scare her or drag her into my problems, so I said nothing about the recorder, the USB drive, or the conversations I had overheard. She nodded sympathetically, made me tea, wrapped me in a blanket. Still, she was shocked by what I had told her. Once I regained a bit of strength, we went to the police together. But they told us it was a civil dispute and recommended we speak to a lawyer. Maybe if I had shown them everything I'd found right then, things would have gone differently. But I was afraid that it wouldn't be enough, afraid they'd laugh at me, accuse me of imagining things in a fit of grief. My colleague gave me some money and the name of a lawyer known for helping people in difficult situations. I decided I'd show him the recorder and the printed emails. Maybe he could find something, some clue. Maybe we could hold someone accountable. But to reach him, I needed to call and make an appointment, and I had no phone. I didn't want to bother my colleague again, so I decided to go to a cyber cafe on the other side of town. I had to check what was on that USB stick. There might be crucial evidence there. I borrowed warm clothes and headed out into the freezing day. Once again, that biting wind lashed my face with pain, but I pressed on. My soul was in chaos. Grief over my husband's death mixed with rising anxiety and growing hatred for my mother-in-law, and deep inside I felt it. Everything that had happened wasn't random. It was all part of some vile plan, meant to bury a terrible truth. I kept replaying the words from my husband's voice recorder in my head. "If I don't make it, please." But he never said what he wanted me to do. He didn't have time to say what mattered most. When I entered the dimly lit cyber cafe and saw students and others sitting calmly at their tables, I felt like I had stepped into a parallel reality, one where everyone around me was absorbed in their ordinary lives while mine was falling apart. I paid for a bit of computer time and inserted the USB drive. It contained several files, text documents, and a folder with video recordings. My heart nearly burst from my chest when I saw the videos. Conversation_1.mp4, Conversation_2.mp4. I decided to check the text files first, but they were encrypted, password protected. It was an unpleasant surprise, but I understood. My husband hadn't wanted strangers to access that data. The videos fortunately opened without a password. The first file was very short, just a few seconds. It appeared to be recorded with a hidden camera. I saw my mother-in-law appear in the frame, alongside a man I didn't recognize at first, but it seemed to be the same man I had seen with her earlier. I heard their voices. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" she asked. "Almost," he replied, "but he already ran the tests." Then there was a loud noise, someone rushing toward the camera, and the recording cut off. I held my breath. This was clear evidence that they had been planning something against my husband. The second video was longer, and it appeared to have been recorded by my husband himself. From the sound, I could tell he had hidden the microphone in his pocket and was trying to point the camera discreetly toward the people speaking. The image was unclear, but I recognized the voices. My mother-in-law again. "If he keeps digging, we won't get the insurance money, and we need that money." "Don't you dare ruin this, do you hear me?" she hissed. "Calm down," the man said. "I've already handled everything. Soon he'll be transferred to us. I swapped the pills." My headphones almost fell from my ears. This sounded like a real conspiracy against my husband. I couldn't bring myself to say the word murder. But it seemed they had tampered with his medication. Maybe that was why he had that sudden heart attack. A lump formed in my throat. My vision blurred. Tears streamed down my face. They had killed my husband, his own mother, and her accomplice. For what? The insurance? It was no secret that he was insured for a substantial sum, and his mother had been listed as the sole beneficiary long before we married. It seemed she had never changed it. But how could she do this? And who was that man? My husband had mentioned his father before. Was this somehow connected to his father's death? Had they killed him too, for the inheritance? I was terrified. I felt I had to get out of the cybercafe before I completely broke down. With trembling hands, I removed the USB stick, tucked it deep into my pocket, paid for my session, and stepped out into the street. The air felt even colder now, and yet I was burning inside. I no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. A terrifying picture had begun to emerge of a brutal, calculated crime. If this was all true, then my mother-in-law was a true monster. A woman who had murdered her own son for money, and possibly her husband before him. And me, I had likely been next, because I was the one person who could stop her from taking the inheritance. And now, these new plans about the will, the safe, the money. Back with my colleague, I began frantically calling different institutions, but everywhere I went, they required official documentation and advised me to go to the police with a lawyer. Luckily, the lawyer I had wanted to contact agreed to meet with me the following evening. I asked a friend to accompany me to confirm my identity. I was too afraid to go alone. The next 24 hours were agonizing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced my mother-in-law might be following me. She could suspect that I hadn't vanished so easily. The next day, my colleague and I met the lawyer in his modest office, cluttered with case files and folders. I laid out the printed emails and showed him the most incriminating parts of the video footage I had managed to copy to a disk. The lawyer looked troubled, though also skeptical, clearly aware of the gravity. "This is serious," he said, "but we'll need a full investigation. We can't go to the prosecutor with just suspicions of murder based on a couple of short videos. We need forensic confirmation that the medication was tampered with. We need test results, your husband's medical records, official requests to the hospital and the insurance companies. If everything is as you say, then yes, this could be a major case." I listened, and I understood. It wouldn't be easy. Some of the documents had already been destroyed. But the lawyer assured me that if we acted intelligently and carefully, we could obtain copies through official channels. Still, I was tormented by the thought that my mother-in-law was capable of anything. She could bribe the people we needed to talk to. She could silence witnesses. We discussed ways to protect me. In the end, the lawyer suggested I go to a women's shelter, someplace safe for those in danger. I had no choice but to accept. I didn't want to live in a shelter, but I wanted even less to end up back in the streets at minus 30 degrees, or worse, fall into my mother-in-law's clutches again. Weeks passed. With the lawyer's help, I submitted a formal request to restore my rights as the widow of the apartment's legal owner. At the same time, we filed for a re-examination of my husband's death, citing suspected medical negligence or intentional poisoning. My evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to initiate an investigation. This news must have reached my mother-in-law. Soon after, I received a message from her through acquaintances. "If you don't stop, you'll regret it." My skin crawled. She had threatened me directly, but I knew I couldn't stop. I swore to myself that I would find the truth. Otherwise, my husband would never find peace. Meanwhile, my financial situation was dire. I couldn't return to work. I was afraid she or her accomplice would track me down. I was living off my savings and the help of a friend. The lawyer helped me file for social assistance, but that process took time. It felt like my whole life had turned upside down. Just a few months ago, I had a home, a family, and a sense of security. Now I was wandering between shelters and offices, trying to protect myself from my own husband's relative. Soon we learned that my mother-in-law was attempting to dispute my marriage, claiming we never officially registered it, or that it was fraudulent and therefore I was entitled to nothing. I nearly exploded with rage. How dare she? How could she diminish our relationship like that? We were a real family, we loved each other, and now she was trying to paint me as some kind of imposter. Amid this chaos, an older woman contacted me, introducing herself as a longtime friend of my husband's late father. She had heard about my efforts to reopen the case and decided to speak up. She told me she had long suspected foul play in his death, but no one wanted to investigate. A rare poison had been found in his bloodstream, but my mother-in-law had covered it up, claiming it was a lab error. Yes, everything had been swept under the rug. Maybe she had already been involved in something dark back then. I listened in horror. It seemed that my mother-in-law really might have killed her husband, and now her son. All for money? How many people had fallen victim to her greed? At times, I thought about giving up. What if I couldn't fight her? But then I remembered the painful scenes in the hospital. My husband lying there, helpless, his voice on the recorder, and I knew I couldn't surrender. I had to see this through. Around the same time, I started noticing that I was being watched. More than once, after leaving the shelter, I saw a car parked nearby. I was certain the same man from before was sitting inside. Had my mother-in-law hired him to follow me? I went to the police to report the harassment and threats, but they only recommended increasing my security and not walking alone. Easier said than done. I couldn't afford bodyguards. In the midst of everything, the lawyer urged me to use the materials I'd already found to speed up the criminal case. But one thing still bothered me. The USB drive contained encrypted files we couldn't open. What if they held even more damning evidence? We had tried to crack the password with the help of a local technician, but with no luck. We needed someone more advanced. Or maybe the password was hidden somewhere, in my husband's belongings. But all his things were still in my mother-in-law's apartment. I couldn't go there. She had changed the locks and likely already cleaned everything up. Then fate gave me another chance. One afternoon, my old neighbor from the building where we had lived with my husband called me. She told me my mother-in-law had left, and apparently for a long time. The neighbor overheard her saying she'd be gone for weeks to deal with inheritance and the sale of some property. She seemed confident I wouldn't return. But I had no intention of letting her settle anything without me. This might be my only chance to enter that apartment again and look for clues. Yes, it would be technically illegal entry, but legally, the apartment belonged to my husband. I was his wife. When the lawyer heard my plan, he shook his head. "It's risky," he said, "but if you decide to go, be extremely careful." I had decided, I still don't know what exactly drove me. Desperation, a thirst for truth, a sense of duty. Probably all of it at once. Just like last time, I waited in the stairwell until I was sure the apartment was empty. My neighbor confirmed that the mysterious man had left too, but she wasn't sure if there was any security system or alarm installed. Still, when I arrived at the building, I decided to take the risk. As I expected, the door now had a new lock, but strangely enough, the old key still hung from my ring. This time, it no longer fit. I had to try something else. I turned to the services of a locksmith, technically a housebreaker, recommended by a lawyer acquaintance. It was illegal, but I felt I had no other option. When the door finally opened, a wave of adrenaline surged through my body. The apartment was cold and dim. I looked down the hallway where our wedding photos had once hung. Now they were gone. The entire atmosphere felt even more lifeless than it had the last time I was there. I shut the door firmly behind me so no one would notice and began methodically searching room by room. The wardrobes had been meticulously emptied. In the bedroom, almost nothing remained. I checked the same nightstand where my husband used to keep coins. It was bare. I looked under the bed. The old suitcase was gone. I was beginning to lose hope. Then I remembered how my husband used to store copies of his passwords, always in absurd places, just so no one would ever guess. He used to say, "The most important things should be hidden in plain sight, where no one thinks to look." I went to the living room, to the bookshelf. That was the one part of the apartment that hadn't changed. We had kept lots of old books, detective novels and sci-fi stories my husband had loved. I started pulling them out one by one, flipping through the pages. And just as I hoped, in one of the volumes, I found a folded note tucked inside. It looked like a password, a string of letters and numbers. I quickly transcribed it into my notebook and, not wanting to lose a second, kept searching. Eventually, I found another unexpected hiding spot. Behind a copy of Crime and Punishment, an envelope stuck out slightly. Inside was a printed excerpt from my husband's medical file. Diagnosis: toxic poisoning of unknown origin. The date was just 1 week before his death, so the doctors had suspected poisoning. But my mother-in-law told me it was just a cold and heart trouble. Had she pressured them to hide the test results? Seeing that document, I had no doubt left. My husband did not die by accident. And now, I had stronger proof. I had barely caught my breath when I heard footsteps outside the door. Every hair on my body stood on end. Someone was coming back. My heart pounded so loudly, it felt like the whole building could hear it. Was it her, my mother-in-law, her accomplice? I rushed to the window, but it was the second floor. I didn't dare jump. Seeing no place to hide, I quietly cracked the door open and peeked into the hallway. It was a neighbor, stepping outside into the yard. Relief flooded my body. She wouldn't report me. I stepped out, gently closing the door behind me, and whispered, "Thank you for warning me." The neighbor gave a knowing nod, as if to say, "Hurry." And I hurried down the stairs. I don't think I would have had the chance to escape if it had really been my mother-in-law. Back at the shelter, I went immediately to my lawyer. Together, we entered the password into the encrypted files on the USB drive. This time, we got in. It opened to a massive archive of documents, correspondence between my husband and the hospital, his test results, letters to a toxicology expert who had warned him that certain medications could trigger cardiac issues, arrhythmia, and other complications, especially when combined with potent plant-based poisons. There were also drafts of letters from an unknown informant warning him to stay away from the person closest to him, a chillingly ambiguous phrase. Further down, we found correspondence regarding a large insurance payout. The insurer was requesting confirmation that my husband was in good health. It turned out that my mother-in-law had taken out a new life insurance policy on my husband, naming herself the sole beneficiary, and she had done it without my knowledge. The date matched the period when my husband had first begun experiencing symptoms. So she had planned it all along? The lawyer studied the files and nodded grimly. "This isn't just family drama," he said. "This is a serious crime. And if we can show that your husband's father also died under similar circumstances, this case will gain traction fast." He warned me, though. "Your mother-in-law won't stop at anything. We need to contact the police to protect you." I agreed. I could feel it now, a real threat to my life. We submitted expanded statements to the police with the new evidence. Finally, the case began to move forward. I was summoned to testify and told them everything I knew. The investigator seemed intrigued. He told me that if my claims were verified, this could become a high-profile trial. Still, I was afraid of retaliation, of that man. Time passed. My mother-in-law must have heard that a criminal case had been opened. She stopped contacting me. No more threats. Maybe she decided to vanish. Maybe she left town, but I knew she would reappear, especially once the inheritance process began. And if her guilt in 2 murders came to light, it could mean life in prison. I also knew I couldn't face her alone. I was vulnerable. The lawyer did all he could, but our resources were limited. Then everything changed. The investigator managed to locate the doctors who had examined my husband shortly before his death, and they testified. They said they had found his condition suspicious, but under pressure from a relative, whom they described as influential, and certain third parties, they had looked the other way. That testimony shook the authorities. My mother-in-law came under direct scrutiny. We also confirmed that the insurance policy she had taken out on my husband had been issued just months before his death. I began to believe, just a little, that justice might still exist. But I also knew that the trial could drag on, that our evidence might not hold if her skilled lawyers found a way to discredit it. Worse, her partner or lover or accomplice had never been arrested. He had simply disappeared. The police issued a warrant, but there were no leads. I started living in constant fear. Every night, I worried they might come for me. Then, one evening, when I was beginning to lose hope, I received a call from the same investigator. "We have new information regarding your safety," he said. I arrived at the station, my legs trembling, barely able to stand, and then I heard the news. My mother-in-law had been arrested, caught trying to sell a plot of land that, as it turned out, was registered in my husband's name. She had forged the documents, changing the owner retroactively, but during the transaction, a discrepancy was found. Real estate agents suspected fraud and alerted the authorities. She was taken into custody. I now had the chance to testify directly in the criminal case. I was sure this time she wouldn't escape. But what terrified me was that the man, her accomplice, was still missing. She was furious. Clearly, she felt betrayed, abandoned. I figured she would try to shift all the blame onto him, and she did. During interrogation, she claimed I had made everything up, that I had forged the documents myself. But the investigator, armed with the doctor's testimonies and the video evidence, wasn't fooled. They told me she might face prison time, but a conviction was still a long road away, full of hearings and more evidence gathering. And most importantly, there was still no conclusive determination of my husband's cause of death. The experts said that proving poisoning months after burial would be extremely difficult. It would require an exhumation. I froze when I heard that word. It meant digging up my husband's body, burying him all over again. The idea shattered my soul, but for the truth and for his peace, I agreed. Then came the long, agonizing wait for forensic results. During that time, I left the shelter and moved into a small rented room. But I was still afraid to walk the streets alone. What if the accomplice came back? My lawyer reassured me, with your mother-in-law in custody, the danger has lessened. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Every day in that limbo, my anxiety grew. So did the urge to run, to flee anywhere, just to stop feeling this crushing sorrow. But I knew I had to see this through. Because once I started this fight, there was no turning back. And yet, at night, I would often wake up from nightmares where I saw my husband asking me to stop, warning me that the truth would only bring more pain. But during the day, I would silence those doubts, convincing myself they were just dreams. In reality, I had to be strong. When the forensic results finally came in, I was summoned to the police station. Not only was the investigator there, but also officials from the prosecutor's office. I sensed that something significant had happened. They informed me that traces of a rare plant-based poison had been found in my husband's remains, one that, when combined with the wrong medications, could cause cardiac collapse. This directly confirmed my theory of a violent death, but who had administered the poison? My mother-in-law continued to deny any involvement, insisting that I was slandering her out of spite. My lawyer was furious. Still, the trial required formal proof of direct guilt. We needed a witness, someone who had seen her give him the medication, someone who had seen the act. Meanwhile, new details surfaced. It turned out that decades ago, my husband's father had also been prescribed certain medications, later pulled from the market due to dangerous interactions with specific substances. He too had a hefty insurance policy, with my mother-in-law listed as the beneficiary. My lawyer pushed for a full review of that case, but too much time had passed. Many documents were gone. Still, the pattern of coincidences was disturbingly consistent. I began attending court hearings. My mother-in-law sat across from me, cold, expressionless, looking at me with eyes filled with malice. Sometimes her hatred was so intense, I felt the urge to leave the courtroom. I understood that she despised me for surviving, for standing up to her. But deep down, one question tormented me. Had she always been a monster? Or had greed and cynicism twisted her soul over time? Once, she had been a young woman, a wife, a mother. What path leads someone to take lives with their own hands for the sake of money? I had no answer. The trial dragged on. Hearings were postponed. She filed motions, changed lawyers, invented new versions of events. I endured it all, though sometimes despair swallowed me whole. There were moments I feared she might escape again, because the evidence, though damning, wasn't absolute. Yes, the poison had been found, but no one had seen her administer it. Yes, we had videos, but the quality wasn't perfect. She claimed it was manipulated, that she had merely repeated others' words. No one had found the man who could confirm her involvement or take the fall. My lawyer urged me not to give up. And then something unexpected happened. The elderly woman we knew, the friend of my husband's late father, found old diaries written by him. In them, he expressed suspicion toward his wife, suspicions of infidelity and of a deliberate car accident. The journals also mentioned secret dealings with a pharmaceutical company. We handed the diaries over to the authorities. The notion that my mother-in-law had been involved in shady dealings years ago now seemed more than plausible. They were still only circumstantial pieces, but they completed the picture. Meanwhile, the question of my rights to the apartment was also being addressed. The court temporarily prohibited my mother-in-law from disposing of her late son's property while the investigation continued. At my lawyer's request, I was allowed to return, but I was too afraid to live there. The place was steeped in memories and horror. Still, since I was granted access, I went back, only to gather the last of my personal belongings. The apartment felt even emptier. Some furniture was missing, items had vanished, boxes lay open and scattered. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, walls that had once echoed with our laughter and dreams. Silence enveloped me, as if all the good had left with him. I remembered how it all began, with my mother-in-law throwing me out into the freezing December morning without even letting me dress. Tears burned my eyes. I tried to stay composed because I knew this entire journey had led to one moment. The moment of truth. The moment when she would either confess or be cornered by irrefutable evidence. And then came the day I had awaited, equal parts fear and hope. A new witness was called, someone long gone. It was him, the man I had seen with my mother-in-law, her accomplice. It turned out he had been in the hospital after an accident and had only recently regained consciousness. That had prevented him from fleeing. His testimony stunned the court. He said my mother-in-law had indeed convinced him to help eliminate her son by swapping his medications to ensure they could collect the insurance payout. She promised him a percentage, but once everything was set in motion, she dumped him, either out of fear or greed. According to him, she had also been involved in the suspicious death of her husband years before. He hadn't witnessed it personally, but knew of it from her own lips. His confession was entered into the official record. He claimed remorse, asked for leniency. I sat in the courtroom, about to faint. I never thought I'd live to see the day when it would all be acknowledged, nearly face to face. They had killed the person I loved, his own mother. Everything buzzed around me like a fog. I thought my heart might stop. But somewhere deep inside there was also a release. Finally, the truth had emerged, and she couldn't escape. My mother-in-law sat pale, whether from fury or shock, and glared at him, spitting that he was lying, that it was slander. But the court already had the videos, the forensic reports, the doctor's testimonies. It was done. The jury had no doubt. She was found guilty of the intentional murder of her son for the purpose of insurance fraud and of attempted unlawful appropriation of his assets. There might still be an investigation into the husband's death, but too many years had passed. Evidence was lacking, though her involvement was considered highly probable. My mother-in-law was sentenced to a long prison term. I could only stand aside, trying to hold back tears, knowing that no verdict would ever bring him back. When I heard the judge's final words, I wanted to drop to my knees from a mix of relief and despair. On the one hand, I had achieved justice. I had proven that my husband's death was no accident, but murder. On the other, nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't bring back the man I loved, and the nightmare I had lived through would remain with me forever. I left the courtroom without waiting for any formalities. Honestly, I didn't want to see them lead her away. Everyone around me assumed I could now peacefully inherit the apartment and other assets, but I knew that would bring no happiness. I had tasted too much bitterness inside those walls. Soon, I decided to sell the apartment and leave, but not out of fear, because everything in that city breathed memories. I wanted to start over, though I knew it would take time for the wounds to heal. Before leaving, I stepped into our apartment one last time, the same door from which I had been thrown out one brutal winter morning, those same walls I had once hidden behind, fearing my mother-in-law and her lover. I walked through the rooms, ran my fingers over the wall where my husband and I had once planned the nursery. Tears streamed down my face. I remembered the best moments of our life, how we laughed, argued over silly things, made up, dreamed of the future. I knew all of that was gone, but I also felt that I had done what he would have wanted. I had brought everything to light. I hadn't let her get away with it. Gathering what was left of my things, I turned off the gas, switched off the lights, and walked out, locking the door behind me. That chapter had to be closed once and for all. No final note, no goodbye, no regret. Everything I could do for my husband, I had done. Now I had to move forward, step by step, piece by piece, rebuild myself, and if there was any comfort in that moment, it was knowing that truth had prevailed in the end, even at such a terrible cost.